The slap cracked through the air, louder than the murmur of the busy gas station. Heads turned. Conversations died. The boy, barely a teenager, stumbled backward, clutching his cheek in shock. His wide, teary eyes locked on the towering officer before him, whose face was twisted in a smug scowl. "I said, get out of the car," the officer barked, gripping the boy's wrist tighter, yanking him forward like he was nothing more than a rag doll. His uniform gleamed under the midday sun, but there was no mistaking the venom in his tone, the contempt dripping from every word. The boy's voice was a fragile whisper, barely audible. "I wasn't doing anything, sir. I was just waiting for my dad." "Shut your mouth," the officer interrupted, his grip tightening, his gaze darting around to see who might be watching. "People like you think you can loiter around wherever you want. Not on my watch." The father stepped out of the car, his movements calm, deliberate. His face betrayed no anger, no panic, just an eerie, chilling calm that made those who dared to meet his eyes take a step back. The officer's focus shifted to him, his bravado swelling at the sight of a man who, to him, looked no different than the boy, unimportant. "You got something to say?" the officer sneered, his hand still gripping the boy's arm. "Maybe you should teach your kid some respect for authority before he ends up in real trouble." The father's voice was measured, each word carefully chosen, his tone slicing through the tension like a blade. "Let him go." The officer let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "Or what? You gonna step up? Let me guess, you think you're someone important. Look, I deal with your kind every day. Always think you can talk your way out of trouble." "You're making a mistake," the father said, his voice steady, his gaze unflinching. The officer rolled his eyes and shoved the boy toward the car, the force of the push nearly sending him to the ground. The boy's father stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice dropping an octave. "Do you even know who you just put your hands on?" The officer's laugh was cold, dismissive. "I don't care. You think a badge like mine takes orders from people like you?" For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that draws people closer, that makes strangers linger to see what happens next. Every breath was heavy, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding. And then the father spoke again, his words cutting through the crowd's murmurs like a thunderclap. "No. But you will." The officer's smirk faltered, just for a second, replaced by something darker. He took a step closer, looming over the father now. "That a threat? You're about to find out what happens when people like you cross me." But it wasn't the father who needed to fear what came next. As the tension mounted, as the weight of the moment hung in the air, an unmistakable shift began. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to gasps, as recognition dawned on one of the bystanders who finally pieced together the man's identity. "What's he gonna do?" someone whispered, their voice tinged with awe. "Does he know who that is?" But the officer, blinded by his arrogance, didn't realize he was on the verge of destroying everything he had worked for. The slap, the humiliation, the audacity, it was all about to come crashing down in a way no one expected. The crowd could feel it, the energy electric with anticipation. The boy's face, still stinging from the slap, turned to his father, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. The father's hand rested on his son's shoulder, steady and reassuring. And for the first time, the boy felt that this moment, this nightmare, might end in justice. But justice doesn't come quietly. It comes with a reckoning. And what happened next would leave the entire city talking for weeks. The officer had made the worst mistake of his career, and the fallout would be more than he ever imagined. How far can one man's arrogance blind him to the truth? And when that truth is revealed, will the boy and his father finally find the justice they deserve? Stick around to find out, this story is only getting started. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. Your voice, your strength, and your resilience matter. This is a space where we amplify stories of justice, empowerment, and meaningful change. Thank you for joining us today. Sit back, enjoy the journey, and remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that inspires and resonates. Now, let's get into it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling gas station parking lot. It was the kind of ordinary weekday afternoon when people stopped for fuel or a quick snack, rushing to wherever life was pulling them. For 12-year-old Malik Carter, however, this stop was supposed to be just another pause on a long road home. He sat quietly in the back seat of his father's black SUV, his headphones loosely hanging around his neck, as his dad stepped out to pay for the gas. Malik was an introverted kid, his world often centered around the sketchbook he carried everywhere, filled with drawings of superheroes and dreamscapes. He didn't speak much, but his father, Darren Carter, understood him without words. Darren Carter was a man of composure. At 45, his tall, broad-shouldered frame and clean-cut demeanor often made people stand at attention, even if they didn't know his title. He moved with a quiet authority, the kind that came from years of leading others and making tough calls. Darren wasn't the type to flaunt his achievements, though there were plenty. As the chief of police for the city, he believed in leading by example, ensuring integrity and fairness in a role that too often had its reputation tarnished. But that day, he wasn't wearing his badge or uniform, just jeans and a polo shirt, blending into the crowd like any other man running errands with his son. Inside the convenience store, Darren paid the cashier and exchanged a polite nod with the clerk. He was thinking about dinner plans, Malik's favorite lasagna recipe, and how he might convince his son to try something other than superheroes for once in his art. Just as he reached the door to leave, something caught his eye, a police cruiser pulling into the lot, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Darren's instincts, honed over decades, didn't flare up immediately. Not until the officer stepped out. Officer Daniel Harper was a veteran of the force, but not the kind of veteran anyone admired. In his late 30s, with a lean, wiry build and sharp blue eyes that seemed to scrutinize every movement around him, Harper had a reputation, one whispered about in break rooms and community meetings alike. He was the type of cop who thrived on authority, who interpreted the badge as a license to dominate rather than serve. For years, he had walked a fine line, his conduct questionable but never crossing far enough to warrant significant disciplinary action. Today, Harper was here for a routine patrol, or so it seemed. Outside, Malik sat doodling in his sketchbook, unaware of the officer's gaze landing on him. Harper's steps were deliberate as he approached the SUV, his hand resting on his belt. Something about the boy, his relaxed demeanor, the way he sat quietly, seemingly out of place, triggered a reflexive suspicion. Harper's voice cut through the hum of engines and chatter, sharp and commanding. "Hey, you," Harper called, his tone laced with authority. "What are you doing sitting in there? Step out of the car." Malik froze, his pencil slipping from his fingers onto the car floor. He blinked, unsure if the officer was talking to him. He opened the door slightly, his small voice barely audible. "I'm just waiting for my dad. He's inside, out." "Now," Harper barked, stepping closer, his expression hardening. Inside the store, Darren looked up just in time to see Harper standing by his car. He frowned, his stride quickening as he pushed the door open and stepped into the lot. Harper was leaning closer to Malik now, one hand gripping the door frame as the boy stumbled out, wide-eyed and trembling. "I wasn't doing anything," Malik stammered, his voice cracking. "Don't argue with me, kid," Harper snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can just sit around here looking suspicious? I've seen enough of you types loitering and causing trouble." Darren's footsteps were deliberate, his jaw tight as he approached the scene. "What's going on here, officer?" His voice was calm but firm, the kind that carried weight even when restrained. Harper turned, his lip curling slightly as he sized up Darren, who still appeared to be just another civilian. "Your kid here was acting suspicious. Probably up to no good." Darren's gaze flickered to Malik, who stood frozen, clutching his sketchbook against his chest. There was a beat of silence before Darren spoke again, his voice even lower. "Let him go." Harper's laugh was sharp and mocking. "Excuse me? You don't get to tell me how to do my job. Maybe you should teach your kid some respect." The tension in the air was palpable, drawing the attention of other customers. Darren stepped closer, his movements deliberate, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I said, let him go. He's done nothing wrong." Harper squared his shoulders, his voice growing louder. "And who exactly are you to tell me what to do? I don't take orders from you." Malik flinched slightly as Harper's hand moved toward him again, and Darren's voice cut through the growing crowd like a blade. "You're making a mistake." But Harper was too far gone in his arrogance to listen. To him, Darren was just another man trying to challenge his authority, and Malik was just another kid who didn't belong. Harper's smirk widened as he leaned closer, his next words barely audible but no less venomous. "I've seen your kind before. You think you're untouchable. But out here, I'm in charge." Darren's gaze was steely, his tone unyielding as he spoke again. "You'll regret this." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken consequences. Harper chuckled, brushing them off as empty threats. He had no idea how wrong he was. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, phones beginning to rise as bystanders filmed the unfolding scene. Malik looked up at his father, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. Darren's expression didn't waver, but deep in his eyes, there was a promise, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Harper, oblivious to the weight of the moment, turned his back on Darren, his focus still on Malik. But Darren didn't move. He stood tall, his presence commanding, his silence speaking volumes. The gas station lot, once filled with the mundane hum of daily life, now buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. And though none of them knew it yet, this moment, this seemingly ordinary confrontation, was about to change everything. The atmosphere at the gas station was heavy as Darren stood his ground, his posture unwavering despite the growing tension. Around them, whispers carried through the onlookers who had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the escalating confrontation. Harper, emboldened by the attention, sneered as he turned back toward Darren, his voice dripping with disdain. "Are you still standing there?" "I told you to step back," Harper said, his hand now resting on his belt as if to remind everyone of the authority he carried. His gaze darted toward Malik, who clutched his sketchbook tightly against his chest. "And as for you, don't think you're walking away from this without consequences. I know how kids like you operate." Malik's voice was trembling when he finally spoke, his words quiet but defiant. "I didn't do anything wrong." Harper's laugh was sharp, cruel, and loud enough to make the bystanders flinch. "Wrong? You think loitering in someone else's car isn't suspicious? What do you even have in that notebook of yours? Plans to rob this place?" Darren's jaw clenched, his voice cutting through the officer's mockery like steel. "That's enough. My son doesn't owe you an explanation. And if you keep this up, you'll find yourself answering questions you're not prepared for." Harper turned slowly, his smirk fading into something darker. He stepped closer to Darren, his voice lowering as he said, "I've seen this kind of attitude before. You think you're above the law, don't you? Just because you can string a few words together, you think you can intimidate me?" Darren didn't flinch. His eyes bore into Harper's with a calm intensity that made the officer pause, if only for a second. "Intimidate you? No. But I will hold you accountable." The words hung heavy in the air, a promise wrapped in a quiet certainty that seemed to chip away at Harper's bravado. The officer's hand shifted on his belt, a subtle but deliberate motion meant to reassert his dominance. "Accountable? You're out of your league, old man." From the edge of the crowd, a bystander spoke up, their voice shaking with a mix of nerves and outrage. "Why are you even bothering them? That kid didn't do anything. You're out of line." Harper whipped his head around, his glare silencing the voice immediately. "Mind your own business," he snapped before turning back to Darren and Malik. "This isn't a debate. You don't get to make demands here." Malik's breathing was shallow, his grip on his sketchbook tightening as he stepped closer to his father. Darren placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that seemed to steady the boy even as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Darren's voice was low but firm when he spoke again. "I'm not making demands, officer. I'm giving you an opportunity to walk away before this gets worse." Harper's face twisted into a sneer, his laugh ringing hollow in the thick silence. "Worse? You're delusional. You don't have a clue who you're dealing with." The crowd shifted uneasily, their murmurs growing louder as more phones were raised to record the scene. The tension was palpable now, an invisible thread pulling tighter with every passing second. Darren's expression didn't waver, but there was a quiet storm behind his eyes, a controlled fury that made it clear he wasn't backing down. Then, as if to punctuate his authority, Harper stepped closer to Darren, his voice dripping with venom. "I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to call this in, and you're going to regret wasting my time." Darren tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Make your call." Harper froze for a split second, caught off guard by the response. He hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio, as if he wasn't entirely sure what to do next. Darren took a small step forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried enough weight to silence even the loudest bystander. "You think you have control here, but you don't. Not anymore." Harper opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a new voice broke through the tension, loud and authoritative. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly as a second officer approached, his expression a mix of confusion and concern as he took in the scene. He was younger than Harper, his demeanor far less aggressive, and his gaze flickered nervously between his partner and the man standing calmly before him. "Daniel, what's this about?" Harper's posture stiffened, his confidence faltering slightly as he gestured toward Malik. "Loitering. Suspicious behavior. I was handling it." The younger officer frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Darren and Malik. Something about the older man's presence made him hesitate, his instincts telling him there was more to the situation than Harper was letting on. Suspicious behavior? He's a kid. Sitting in a car. Are you sure this is necessary? Harper's face reddened, his frustration bubbling over as he snapped, "Don't question me, Carter. I know what I'm doing." The younger officer blinked, the name catching him off guard. His gaze shifted to Darren, recognition dawning slowly but surely as the pieces began to fall into place. His breath hitched slightly as he stammered, "Wait. Darren raised a hand, cutting him off before he could finish. His eyes remained locked on Harper, his voice steady as he said, "I'm the father of this boy. That's all you need to know right now." The younger officer swallowed hard, his demeanor shifting as he stepped back slightly, his unease evident. Harper, oblivious to his partner's growing discomfort, pressed on, his voice louder and more forceful. "I don't care who you are. This is my scene, and I'll handle it as I see fit." Darren's silence was deafening, his composure unshaken even as Harper's arrogance reached its peak. The crowd watched with bated breath, their anticipation building as the storm brewing beneath the surface threatened to erupt. Malik looked up at his father, his fear mingling with a flicker of hope, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the moment shifting. The tension was electric now, the air heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. Every gaze was fixed on Darren, waiting for his next move, for the calm man with the quiet strength to reveal the full extent of his power. Harper's smirk faltered for just a second, a flicker of doubt crossing his face as the weight of Darren's words began to sink in. And in that moment, as the scene reached its breaking point, it became clear that this confrontation was far from over. What was unfolding here was only the beginning of a reckoning that would leave everyone involved forever changed. The gas station parking lot had grown quieter, but the silence was anything but peaceful. It was the tense kind of silence that lingered, and everyone knew something bigger was about to happen. Darren stood tall, his hand resting protectively on Malik's shoulder as Harper's bravado filled the air like a toxic fog. The younger officer who had just arrived remained frozen, his unease palpable as he glanced between Darren and his partner. The crowd had swelled slightly, their murmurs now only a faint backdrop to the confrontation. Harper took a deliberate step forward, his smirk laced with arrogance as he pointed a finger toward Darren. "You think you can come here and play the hero? You're nothing more than a loudmouthed dad trying to get in the way of real police work." Darren's voice was calm, but the weight it carried was undeniable. "This isn't about police work. This is about you crossing a line you should never have approached in the first place." Harper scoffed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Oh, is that right? You think you're gonna lecture me? You're just another guy who doesn't understand how the real world works. Out here, I'm the one in charge. Not you. Not your kid." Malik shifted uncomfortably beside his father, his knuckles white as he clutched his sketchbook. Darren placed a steadying hand on his son's arm, his voice soft as he spoke without looking away from Harper. "It's okay, Malik. Just stay close." Harper's laughter was harsh, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Stay close? What, you think you're protecting him from me? I'm doing my job. Maybe if you taught your kid some respect, he wouldn't be in this situation." The words hit like a slap, the crowd stirring with discomfort as Darren's gaze darkened. He took a slow step forward, his tone still measured but laced with something sharper. "My son doesn't need to learn respect from someone like you. And if you had any understanding of what it means to wear that uniform, you'd know that respect isn't demanded. It's earned." Harper bristled, his face reddening as his hand hovered over his belt again. "You don't get to stand here and talk to me like that. You don't know who you're dealing with." Darren's expression didn't waver, but there was a glint in his eye that made Harper falter, just for a second. The younger officer took a cautious step closer, his voice hesitant. "Harper, maybe we should take a step back." "I think, quiet," Harper snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I don't need your input. I've got this under control." But control was slipping, and everyone could see it. Darren tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but deliberate as he spoke again. "Do you, Officer Harper? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've lost control entirely." Harper's jaw tightened, his confidence faltering for just a moment before he barked back, "You don't know anything about me. I've been doing this job for years. I know what trouble looks like." Darren took another step closer, his presence commanding in a way that wasn't loud or aggressive but undeniably powerful. "Do you? Because right now, all I see is a man so blinded by his own arrogance that he doesn't even realize the ground is crumbling beneath his feet." The younger officer looked increasingly uncomfortable, his gaze darting toward Darren as he cleared his throat. "Harper, listen. I think we should call this in. Maybe get a supervisor down here." Harper whipped around, his anger now directed at his partner. "Are you serious? I don't need a supervisor to handle this. This guy thinks he's untouchable, and I'm not about to let him walk away like nothing happened." The words hung in the air, a bitter echo that seemed to charge the atmosphere with even more tension. Darren let out a slow breath, his voice dropping just slightly. "Untouchable? No, Officer Harper. I'm not untouchable. But you're about to learn what accountability looks like." Harper blinked, the shift in Darren's tone sending a ripple of unease through him. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of a car door opening cut through the air. Darren turned slightly, his movements deliberate as he reached into the SUV and retrieved something from the passenger seat. When he straightened, a sleek black badge case was in his hand. Harper's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" Darren flipped the case open with a practiced motion, revealing the gleaming badge inside. His voice was steady but carried the full weight of his authority. Chief Darren Carter. Head of the police department. Your boss. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to shake the very foundation of the moment. Harper's face went pale, his arrogance melting away as his brain scrambled to process the words. What? Darren stepped closer, his badge still in hand, his expression unrelenting. You didn't bother to ask, did you? You were so busy flexing your authority that you didn't even stop to consider who you were dealing with. Let me spell it out for you, Officer Harper. You just assaulted the son of your commanding officer. Harper stumbled back, his hand falling away from his belt as panic crept into his voice. This can't be real. You're lying. The younger officer stared at Darren with wide eyes, the pieces clicking into place as he stammered, He's not lying, Harper. I've seen him before. That's Chief Carter. Darren didn't wait for Harper to respond. He took another step forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. You've spent your career hiding behind that badge, using it as a shield to justify behavior that has no place in this department. And today, you crossed a line you can't come back from. Harper's hands trembled slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I didn't mean, Darren cut him off, his voice firm. You didn't mean to get caught. That's the only truth in your words right now. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording as the confrontation reached its peak. Harper's confidence had crumbled entirely, replaced by the stark reality of what he had done. Darren's presence loomed over him, not in a physical sense, but in the sheer weight of his authority and the undeniable justice he was about to deliver. Harper's fall had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The reckoning had arrived, and it was going to be unforgettable. Harper's face was a canvas of disbelief and panic as Darren's words settled over him like an unrelenting storm. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes darting between the officer and the man who had just revealed himself as the head of the police department. Darren's calm, authoritative presence seemed to grow, filling the space, leaving no room for Harper's usual tactics of intimidation. Malik, standing close to his father, watched with wide eyes, a mixture of awe and confusion playing across his young face. Harper's voice wavered as he tried to regain some semblance of control. Chief Carter, I didn't know it was you. If I had known, Darren cut him off sharply, his tone unyielding. You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You didn't care who my son was. All you saw was a boy sitting in a car, and you decided that was enough reason to humiliate and assault him in front of a crowd. Harper's mouth opened and closed, the words catching in his throat as he struggled to find a defense. It wasn't like that. You thought you had power, Darren interrupted, his voice growing colder with each word. You thought you could act without accountability because you've gotten away with it before. Isn't that right? The younger officer shifted uncomfortably beside Harper, his face pale as he avoided Darren's piercing gaze. Chief, I tried to step in. I told him we should back off, but enough, Darren said, holding up a hand to silence him. This isn't about you right now. But don't think for a second that your inaction absolves you from responsibility. You had the opportunity to stop this, and you chose to stand by and let it happen. The younger officer's head hung low, shame etched into every line of his face. Harper, meanwhile, had gone from defensive to desperate, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured toward Darren. Look, I'll admit I made a mistake, but you have to understand, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to do my job. Darren's laughter was quiet, but it was a sharp, bitter sound that cut through Harper's feeble explanation. Your job is to protect and serve. Not to use your badge as a weapon against innocent people. My son was sitting in our car, doing nothing but drawing in his sketchbook, and you decided that was a threat. Tell me, Officer Harper, what part of your training taught you that a boy with a pencil is dangerous? Harper flinched at the question, his gaze darting around the crowd as if searching for an escape. The weight of the stares on him grew heavier, the whispers and murmurs of the onlookers blending into a low hum that seemed to amplify his shame. "Chief, I didn't know. I didn't think, that's exactly the problem," Darren said, his voice cutting through Harper's stammering. "You didn't think. You didn't ask. You didn't stop to consider the consequences of your actions. And now, you're going to face them." Harper's face drained of color as the reality of Darren's words sank in. He took a hesitant step back, his bravado crumbling as he tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Look, I'll cooperate. I'll apologize to your son. We don't need to make this a bigger deal than it is." Malik, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice small but steady. "You think an apology is enough? You embarrassed me. You made me feel like I was nothing." Harper turned to him, his expression flickering with something that might have been regret, but Darren stepped between them before he could respond. "Don't you dare try to justify yourself to him. My son doesn't need your empty words. What he needs is to see that there are consequences for people like you." The crowd grew louder now, emboldened by Darren's unwavering stance. More phones were raised, the lenses capturing every moment, every word. Harper's breathing quickened as the realization that this wasn't going away began to set in. "Chief Carter, please. We can handle this internally. There's no need to escalate." Darren took a step closer, his presence looming over Harper like a shadow. "Internally? You think I'm going to let you walk back into that precinct and pretend this never happened? No, Officer Harper. This stops here. Today." Harper's voice cracked as he tried one last time to plead his case. "I've been on the force for years. I've done good work. One mistake doesn't define me." Darren's gaze hardened, his voice low but carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much and forgiven too little. "It's not one mistake. This is a pattern. A history of abuse and arrogance that ends now. You may have worn that uniform for years, but today, you showed everyone here that you don't deserve it." The younger officer stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Chief, what do you want us to do? How do we fix this?" Darren turned to him, his expression softening slightly but still resolute. "You call it in. You follow protocol. And you make sure this is documented, every step of the way. No cover-ups. No excuses." The younger officer nodded quickly, reaching for his radio with trembling hands. Harper's face twisted in desperation, his voice rising as he tried to stop him. "Wait, you don't have to do this. You don't understand what this will do to me." Darren's voice was ice-cold as he delivered the final blow. "What it will do to you? My son will carry this moment with him for the rest of his life. You'll face the consequences of your actions, and you'll learn what it feels like to be held accountable. That's justice." As the younger officer spoke into his radio, calling for a supervisor in internal affairs, the crowd began to cheer, their voices rising in support of Darren and Malik. Harper stood frozen, his world crashing down around him as the reality of his downfall became undeniable. Darren turned to his son, his voice softening as he placed a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. "It's over, Malik. You're safe now." Malik looked up at his father, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Dad." Darren's gaze lingered on his son, his voice steady and full of conviction. "No, son. Thank you for reminding me why I do this. For you, and for everyone who deserves better than what this man tried to do to you." The scene was electric, the air thick with the weight of justice finally served. Harper's silence was deafening, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing more than a man stripped of his authority and left to face the consequences of his actions. The reckoning was complete, but its impact would echo far beyond that parking lot, a reminder to everyone watching that accountability isn't just a word, it's a promise. The air in the parking lot seemed to shift as the reality of what had just unfolded settled over everyone. The tension that had gripped the crowd was now replaced with an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the younger officer speaking into his radio. Darren remained where he was, his expression steady, though the weight of the moment lingered in his posture. Malik stood by his side, his shoulders still slightly hunched, his grip on his sketchbook now loosened but not entirely at ease. Harper, once brimming with arrogance, stood deflated. His shoulders slumped, his gaze flickering between the crowd and the badge still displayed in Darren's hand. The authority he had wielded so recklessly had been stripped away in mere moments, leaving him exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The weight of Darren's words, the judgment of the onlookers, and the knowledge of what awaited him had robbed him of his voice. The younger officer lowered his radio and turned to Darren, his expression torn between respect and apprehension. "Chief, I've called for internal affairs and the supervisor on duty. They'll be here shortly to handle the situation. Is there anything else you need from me right now?" Darren's gaze remained fixed on Harper for a long moment before he finally turned to the younger officer. "You've done the right thing by reporting this. Now make sure every detail is documented. Every word, every action. I don't want a single part of this swept under the rug." The officer nodded quickly, his movements stiff as he pulled a small notepad from his pocket and began jotting down notes. Darren's voice softened slightly as he added, "And when they get here, make sure they know this isn't about a single incident. This is about a pattern of behavior that has no place in this department." Harper flinched at the words, his voice finally breaking through the silence. "Chief Carter, please. You don't have to do this. You don't have to ruin my career over this." Darren's gaze snapped back to Harper, the intensity of his stare freezing the officer in place. "Ruin your career? You ruined it yourself the moment you decided that your badge gave you the right to demean and harm others. This isn't about me, Harper. This is about the trust you've shattered, not just with my family but with every person you've ever treated like they were less than human." The crowd stirred at Darren's words, murmurs of agreement rippling through them. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of the fallout. Malik shifted closer to his father, his voice quiet but steady as he said, "Does this mean he can't do this to anyone else?" Darren glanced down at his son, his expression softening. "That's the goal, Malik. To make sure people like him are held accountable, so no one else has to go through what you did." Malik nodded slowly, his grip on his sketchbook loosening further. For the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of relief crossed his face, though it was tempered by the lingering fear and humiliation that still clung to him. Darren placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his focus shifting back to Harper. "You think this is just about you," Darren said, his voice low but firm. "But it's bigger than that. This is about the community you were supposed to serve. About the people you failed time and time again. And it's about making sure that failure stops here." Harper's hands clenched at his sides, his voice rising in desperation. "I've done good things for this department. I've put my life on the line. Doesn't that count for something?" Darren's expression didn't waver. "Doing your job doesn't excuse abusing your power. Being a police officer isn't about heroics or accolades. It's about service. And every time you let your arrogance and bias dictate your actions, you betrayed that service." The younger officer, still scribbling in his notebook, hesitated before speaking up. "Chief, if I may. I've seen him do things that didn't feel right. I didn't say anything before because I thought it wasn't my place, but now," Darren's gaze shifted to the younger officer, his tone softening slightly. "Now is the time to speak. If you've seen misconduct, if you've stayed silent because you were afraid of the consequences, this is your chance to do the right thing. No one should feel powerless to stand up for what's right." The officer nodded, his expression determined. "I'll make sure everything is in my report." As the weight of the moment settled over them, the sound of approaching sirens broke through the stillness. The crowd began to shift, some dispersing while others stayed rooted, their curiosity keeping them in place. Harper's face turned even paler as the reality of what was about to happen sank in. Darren turned to his son, his voice quiet but firm. "Malik, I want you to go sit in the car. You don't need to see the rest of this." Malik hesitated, his gaze flickering between his father and the crowd. "Are you sure?" Darren nodded. "I'm sure. I'll be right there." Reluctantly, Malik stepped away, climbing into the back seat of the SUV and shutting the door behind him. Darren watched him for a moment before turning back to Harper, his expression unreadable. The sirens grew louder, and soon, a marked supervisor's car and an unmarked vehicle from Internal Affairs pulled into the lot. Uniformed officers stepped out, their faces serious as they took in the scene. One of the officers, a woman with a commanding presence, approached Darren. "Chief Carter. We were told there was an incident involving one of our officers." Darren nodded, his tone measured. "There was. I've already instructed the reporting officer to document everything. You'll find plenty of witness statements and video evidence as well." The Internal Affairs officers exchanged glances before stepping toward Harper, who looked like he might collapse under the weight of their stares. Darren didn't move, his posture steady as he watched the officers begin their work. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their murmurs fading as the reality of the moment settled over them. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lot, Darren finally let out a slow breath. The weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on him, but there was a sense of resolution in the air. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step toward justice, a step toward making things right. And for Darren, that was enough for now. The parking lot had mostly cleared out, but the tension still clung to the air like an invisible weight. The crowd, though smaller now, remained quiet, their curiosity about the situation keeping a few stragglers rooted in place. Darren stood on the side, his shoulders held high, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil that had just unfolded. The Internal Affairs team, clad in their professional attire, moved efficiently, gathering evidence and taking statements. They had already spoken with the witnesses and retrieved Harper's badge and weapon. The once confident officer now stood several feet away, his posture slumped, and his face pale, a shadow of the man who had barked commands just minutes before. Malik sat in the back seat of the car, his knees pulled close, his hands lightly gripping the edges of his sketchbook. His fingers traced absent circles along the corners of the pages, his mind replaying everything that had happened. Though he felt safer now, the fear and humiliation from earlier still lingered, like faint bruises on his spirit. Every so often, he would glance at his father, watching the way Darren handled the situation with unyielding composure. Malik's young mind struggled to reconcile the image of his dad, the man who helped with his math homework and laughed at cheesy superhero movies, with the commanding figure now standing at the center of the storm. Darren glanced toward the SUV, locking eyes with his son briefly. His expression softened for just a moment, a silent reassurance passing between them. Then he turned back to the officers in front of him, his voice firm but steady. One of the Internal Affairs agents, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, approached him. The agent's tone was low, measured, and carried the professionalism of someone used to navigating tense situations. "Chief Carter, we've completed the initial steps. We've collected statements from the witnesses and reviewed the footage we've received so far. It's clear there's enough evidence to proceed with a formal investigation. Officer Harper won't be returning to duty anytime soon," the agent said, his voice calm but resolute. Darren nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Good. This needs to be thorough. I want every detail documented. Every word, every action. Nothing can be overlooked." The agent's tone shifted slightly, a hint of respect creeping into his words. "You have my assurance, Chief. We'll handle this properly. And, if I may, it's rare to see someone in your position take such a firm stand against one of your own. It takes courage." Darren met his gaze evenly, his voice calm but tinged with steel. It shouldn't take courage. This is the standard we should all be held to. Anything less, and we betray the people we're sworn to serve. The agent nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his face before he stepped back to continue his work. Darren exhaled slowly, his focus shifting to Harper, who stood awkwardly several feet away. The man who had been so loud and sure of himself earlier now seemed lost, his shoulders slumped, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. Harper's face was pale, his eyes darting toward the internal affairs team, then the crowd, then back to Darren, as though searching for an escape from a reality he couldn't change. Finally, Harper spoke, his voice trembling with desperation. "Chief Carter. I know I made a mistake. I know I handled things wrong. But do you really think I deserve to lose everything over this?" Darren walked toward him slowly, his posture calm but deliberate. His voice was measured, carrying the weight of authority. "You're asking the wrong question, Harper. This isn't about what you think you deserve. It's about the harm you've caused. It's about the trust you've broken, not just with me, but with every person you've mistreated while hiding behind your badge." Harper's hands clenched into weak fists at his sides, his voice rising slightly as he tried to defend himself. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Darren's response was quick, his tone unrelenting. "Your job? Your job is to serve and protect, to uphold the values of this community, to be a force for good. And what did you do today? You looked at a boy, sitting quietly in a car, and decided he was a threat. You acted without thinking, without asking questions, and without regard for the harm you were causing. So tell me, Harper, how is that doing your job?" Harper's mouth opened, but no words came. The truth of Darren's statement seemed to crush whatever argument he had been trying to form. His shoulders sagged further, and his head dropped, his gaze fixed on the ground. Darren took a step closer, his voice softening just slightly but still carrying an edge. "This isn't just about today. This is about every time you've let your bias dictate your actions. Every time you've abused your authority because you thought no one would hold you accountable. Today, that changes." Harper looked up, his face etched with desperation. "But I've done good things. I've put my life on the line for this department. Doesn't that count for something?" Darren's expression didn't waver. "Good actions don't erase bad ones, Harper. You don't get to pick and choose when you honor your oath. And you certainly don't get to ask for forgiveness without first acknowledging the harm you've caused." Harper's voice cracked as he tried again. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear." Darren's voice lowered, carrying an almost sorrowful weight. "Intentions don't undo the damage. What matters now is that you face the consequences of your actions. You may not have meant for this to happen, but it did. And now, it's time for you to take responsibility." The younger officer, who had been silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat and hesitantly stepped forward. His voice was nervous but steady. "Chief Carter, I want you to know that I'll include everything in my report. There were times before this when I saw things Harper did that didn't sit right with me. I didn't speak up then, but I will now." Darren's gaze shifted to the younger officer, his tone softening slightly. "It's not easy to speak out, especially in this line of work. But if you're serious about making this right, then make sure your report is truthful and thorough. This isn't just about Harper. It's about changing a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." The younger officer nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure of it." As the internal affairs team began to wrap up their work, the faint sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Malik, watching from the car, glanced nervously at his father as Darren approached the vehicle. When Darren opened the door, Malik's small voice broke the silence. "Is it really over?" Darren paused, his voice gentle as he placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Not yet. But it's a step in the right direction. Malik hesitated, his eyes wide. Do you think he'll ever change? Darren exhaled slowly, his gaze thoughtful. That's up to him, son. Change is hard. It takes courage and accountability. But whether or not he changes doesn't matter as much as making sure people like him are held responsible for their actions. Malik nodded, his grip on his sketchbook loosening slightly. Darren gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping into the driver's seat. As the SUV pulled out of the lot, the gas station began to fade in the rearview mirror. Darren's gaze lingered on the scene for a moment longer, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on his shoulders. But amidst the exhaustion, there was a sense of resolve. The fight wasn't over, but justice had been served that day, and that was enough to push forward. As the SUV moved through the city streets, Malik sat quietly in the back seat, his head resting against the window. The tension from the gas station still lingered in his body, a tight knot in his chest that wouldn't fully unravel. He stared out at the familiar streets passing by, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Darren glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes softening as he took in his son's silence. The boy had barely spoken since they'd left the scene, and Darren could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Malik, Darren said finally, his voice low and steady. I know today was a lot. If there's anything you want to talk about, I'm here. Malik didn't respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on the passing scenery. After a long moment, he turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Why does it have to be like this? Why do people like him think they can treat us that way? Darren's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly before he let out a slow breath. His tone was measured, careful, as he replied. There's no simple answer to that, Malik. Some people carry fear and hatred in their hearts, and they let it guide their actions. It's wrong, and it's unfair, but it's the reality we face. The important thing is that we don't let it break us. Malik frowned, his brows furrowing as he clutched his sketchbook against his chest. But it did break me. For a little while, it did. I felt so small. Darren's chest ached at his son's words, the vulnerability in Malik's voice cutting through him like a knife. He pulled the car into a quiet parking lot and shifted into park, turning in his seat to face his son fully. Malik, listen to me. What happened back there wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. That officer tried to take your power away, but he didn't succeed. You're still standing, still here, and that's a strength he'll never understand. Malik's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his voice trembling. But what if it happens again? What if next time, it's worse? Darren leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto his son's. That's why we fight, Malik. That's why we stand up and make sure people like him are held accountable. So there are fewer next times. So the world becomes just a little bit safer for you and for everyone else. Malik nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes didn't fully fade. Darren reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. And you're not alone in this. You've got me, you've got your mom, and you've got a community that cares about you. Together, we can face anything. Malik looked down at his sketchbook, his fingers tracing one of the drawings on the cover. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke again. Do you think he regrets it? That officer? Darren hesitated, considering the question carefully. Maybe he does, in his own way. Maybe he regrets getting caught more than what he did. Or maybe he's starting to realize the harm he's caused. But regret doesn't fix anything on its own. It's what you do after regret that matters. Malik seemed to mull over his father's words, his expression thoughtful. Darren gave him a small, encouraging smile before turning back to the wheel and pulling out of the lot. The rest of the drive was quiet, but it wasn't the same heavy silence as before. Malik seemed lighter somehow, the conversation having lifted some of the weight off his young shoulders. When they arrived home, Malik climbed out of the car and followed his father to the door. Inside, the comforting smell of home greeted them, mingled with the faint aroma of the lasagna Darren had promised to make. Malik set his sketchbook on the coffee table and sank into the couch, his gaze distant but calmer than it had been earlier. Darren moved into the kitchen, pulling out ingredients with practiced ease. The familiar routine of cooking helped him process the day's events, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables grounding him in the present. As he worked, Malik's voice drifted in from the living room. "Do you think people can change, Dad? Like really change, even if they've done bad things?" Darren paused, his knife hovering over the cutting board. He turned to look at his son, his expression thoughtful. "I think people can change, but it's not easy. It takes a lot of hard work, a willingness to face the truth about themselves, and a commitment to do better. Not everyone is willing to take that step." Malik frowned, his fingers idly flipping through the pages of his sketchbook. "Do you think he will?" Darren set down the knife and walked over to the couch, sitting beside his son. "I don't know, Malik. That's up to him. But what I do know is that we can't let his actions define us. We have to keep moving forward, no matter what." Malik looked up at his father, his eyes searching. "You're not mad at me for not saying anything, are you?" "When he yelled at me, I just froze." Darren's heart ached at the question, and he shook his head firmly. "Malik, you have nothing to be ashamed of. Freezing in a moment like that doesn't mean you're weak. It's a natural reaction to fear. The important thing is that you're safe now, and you stood strong in your own way." Malik nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thanks, Dad." Darren smiled, ruffling his son's hair gently. "Always, kiddo. Now, how about you help me finish this lasagna? I think we've earned a good meal tonight." Malik grinned for the first time that day, a small but genuine smile that warmed Darren's heart. Together, they moved into the kitchen, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they focused on the simple act of cooking. Darren knew there were still challenges ahead, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for, and why he wouldn't stop until the world was a better place for his son. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change that rippled far beyond the gas station parking lot. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into Officer Harper's actions, uncovering not only his misconduct during the incident with Malik but also a troubling history of complaints from the community. The evidence was damning, and Harper's resignation was swift, though it did little to repair the damage he had caused over the years. For Darren, this was only the beginning. Holding one man accountable wasn't enough. He knew the problem ran deeper, and as chief of police, he was determined to address the systemic failures that allowed officers like Harper to thrive unchecked. Darren called for a series of reforms within the department. Mandatory bias training became the first step, followed by the establishment of an independent review board to investigate complaints against officers. Community leaders were invited to monthly meetings, creating an open dialogue between the department and the people it served. Darren knew these changes wouldn't fix everything overnight, but they were a start. He was relentless in his efforts, refusing to let the department he had worked so hard to build fall back into complacency. His reputation as a fair but firm leader grew, earning respect not just from his officers but from the community at large. For Malik, life slowly returned to normal, though the events of that day remained etched in his memory. His sketchbook, once a place of pure imagination, now contained drawings that reflected his experiences. One page held the image of his father standing tall, his presence a protective shield, while another depicted the gas station scene in stark, heavy lines. Malik began sharing his artwork with others, finding that his way of processing what had happened resonated with people. His drawings sparked conversations, not just about the incident but about the broader issues of bias and accountability. Though young, Malik had found a voice through his art, one that carried a message far beyond his years. Harper's life took a sharp and irreversible turn. Stripped of his badge and with his record exposed, he found himself ostracized from the community he once patrolled. Job applications were met with silence, and former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. For the first time, Harper was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. In his isolation, he began attending counseling, spurred not by obligation but by the realization that his unchecked arrogance and bias had destroyed the life he had built. It was a long road, and whether he could truly change remained uncertain, but the cracks in his armor had finally appeared. Darren and Malik's relationship grew stronger in the aftermath. Darren, though always present in his son's life, made an even greater effort to be there, understanding now more than ever the importance of showing Malik that he was not alone. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, Malik shared one of his drawings, a depiction of a superhero standing victorious, his silhouette unmistakably resembling Darren's. Darren chuckled, his voice warm as he said, "I don't know if I can live up to that." Malik smiled, his eyes bright. "You already do." The community, inspired by the events and Darren's leadership, rallied together in unexpected ways. Local businesses began hosting workshops on racial equity, schools implemented programs to educate students on implicit bias, and grassroots organizations grew stronger. Darren attended many of these events with Malik by his side, teaching his son not only about the importance of standing up for what's right but also about the power of unity and understanding. The incident, though painful, had sparked something powerful, a movement toward change. On a quiet evening several months later, Darren stood in his office, the city skyline glowing through the large window behind him. On his desk sat a stack of reports from the review board, alongside notes from community meetings. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His phone buzzed, and when he looked down, he saw a text from Malik, "Dinner's ready. Don't make me eat alone." Darren smiled, his heart full as he gathered his things and headed home. The story wasn't just about what happened that day in the parking lot. It was about what came after, the ripples that turned into waves of change, the lessons learned, and the hope for a better future. Darren's actions reminded everyone that accountability is not just about punishment but about creating a foundation where trust and integrity can thrive. Malik's resilience showed that even in the face of fear and injustice, strength and creativity can carve paths to healing. As you reflect on this story, think about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Darren's calm resolve and Malik's quiet bravery teach us that change often starts with a single act of courage. How do you think you would have reacted in their shoes? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment that made you question what's fair and just? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this, stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength we all carry within. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.